Hello everyone. Today I'd like to talk to you about middle childhood, and we're going to focus on the biosocial development aspect of middle childhood, which is chapter 11. And in this first part of 2 lectures, we're going to talk about health issues, which are important to consider in this developmental period. So when we talk about middle childhood, we're really referring to the time period between early childhood and adolescence. So it's approximately the age of 6, or when they enter elementary school, to about the age of 11, or often when they leave elementary school. And we consider this to be the case even though the onset of adolescence may occur earlier than 11 for some children. It's just a convention that we follow when it comes to, in particular, the psychosocial aspects of the middle childhood years. Interestingly, this time period has been thought by theorists to be particularly calm, a time of stable development where many people think of it as kind of the prime of childhood. And it turns out to be one of the healthiest times in our lives, where we tend to be kept safe by having strong genetics that keep us healthy, and often by being in environments which are thought to have developmentally stabilized from the early childhood period. And it often is a time where we have fewer conflicts with parents and teachers than you might see during the adolescent period when we're all struggling for emancipation. There are also some thoughts that we tend to be healthier during this time because parents are comfortable in their role, understand better through experience how to keep their children safe. We know that young children don't always have the impulse control that they need to keep themselves safe, and as children get older, they are able to anticipate risks and take care of themselves better. We also have some data from the medical field that the onset of immunizations and vaccinations in early childhood help keep us healthy during the years of 6 to 11. So while this is a time of stability, it's thought that children tend to go on a slower developmental rate, both physically and cognitively, but that as they are making these gains, we see the child's entire system strengthening. So health continues to be a positive aspect of middle childhood development in lots of ways. So we're going to talk today about the physical aspects of health, and then later on in chapter 13 we'll talk about the emotional aspects of health. So in middle childhood, it's a pretty important time to make sure that children have developed strong, healthy habits in lots of ways. The first that we'll discuss is oral health. So by the school age, most children are brushing their own teeth, whereas when they're younger, parents are often helping. And it's really important for a child's oral health to make sure they see a dentist in a regular way for preventative care. Another thing that can help with oral health is that many cities have added fluoride to their water since the 60s or 70s, and the tiniest amount of fluoride can actually go a great distance to keeping your teeth strong. Turns out that oral health is important not just for appearances and to keep your mouth feeling good and looking good, but because of the way that your mouth is connected to the rest of your digestive system, and because your oral health has a lot to do with immune factors and actually your circulation across the entire body. It's thought that good oral hygiene is actually protective of your of your heart health as well as your oral health. So helping a child to establish really strong oral health habits during this time period will help them have good oral health as adults. Interestingly, prolonged stress, eating unhealthy foods, or not taking care of your teeth can lead to adverse health effects that don't just involve the mouth, but as I said, could involve the heart or even the kidneys and the liver. So this is a time for building healthy habits. Another one of those habits is to build up an activity habit or to become more engaged in healthy exercise. Several studies have been done on this, and it turns out that how physically active an adult is strongly related to how active those adults were in middle childhood. Many times we learn exercise or we learn to enjoy activities that involve exercise from our families. We also can learn it through school and through engagement in clubs and other things. But developing a sense of enjoying physical exercise and building endurance really does happen in middle childhood. And so that's why organized sports or involvement in daily exercise activities is an important part of a middle child's child's experience. So physical activity and physical play have been associated with better overall health, less obesity or being overweight, which we'll talk more about soon. And there are also some social benefits to being engaged physically. It helps develop friendship skills, cooperation, sense of fairness, can help to develop problem solving, and even self-organization or self-regulation abilities. So something like rock climbing, for example, in middle childhood has been demonstrated in studies to improve executive function, which is your ability to plan and organize. So physical activity in middle childhood not only helps keep our bodies healthy, but can also promote cognitive and emotional development. Socially, the experiences a child has interacting with others in a physical way can also help to build skills. It also can provide opportunities to get to know people from other cultures, other neighborhoods, other regions, other parts of the world. So the advantages of getting a child between the ages of 6 and 11 actively engaged in a physical activity that he or she enjoys are thought to be numerous. I would also add to this that we now know that for children between the ages of 6 and 11 who experience signs of depression, so an overall sad mood, a sense of inertia, not being able to get started, crying for no reason, having a hard time sleeping or eating, all of those physical aspects of depression, several studies have been done that have compared getting a child engaged in rigorous physical activity, at least 20 minutes a day for at least 4 days a week, helps a child dealing with depression as much as having an antidepressant added to their medical regimen. So for children who are experiencing some mood lability, which basically means their moods are changing in ways that are hard to predict and they're not feeling good much of the time, one of the most important things that we try to do as psychologists or behaviorally oriented folks is see if the child is eating well, sleeping well, and if they have enough opportunities for physical activity. There's a phenomena that we call behavioral momentum, which is one of our most important tools against depression. And the idea is that when a person is feeling depressed, this works for children as well as adults, there's a sense of wanting to not move, to just, kind of be a blob, and to not, have new experiences or motivate yourself is really, really hard. If somebody can help the depressed person to keep moving, to get that behavioral momentum going, in other words, force some activity that over time that activity becomes pleasurable, it becomes less of a slog and becomes more of a part of their routine, you can often see mood lifting with an increase in physical activity. So we consider it critical for physical health and also emotional health. During the middle childhood years, we also see ongoing changes in brain development. Now, it may not be as remarkable in intensity as we see in infancy, toddlerhood, or early childhood, but the brain continues to make connections and prune connections. And brain development goes on, as we know, throughout our lifetime. But during middle childhood, we see some very specific advances in connectivity of the brain, which your textbook refers to as neurological advances. These advances have to do with how efficient the connections are between the frontal parts of the brain, your frontal lobe, which is where your attentional system, your emotion system, your regulation, your language, all of that is right there in the front. As connectivity gets more efficient in middle childhood, you'll see children be able to attend to the right thing better. We call that selective attention. Whereas a younger child might get easily distracted, a child in third grade can be expected to sit and listen to something even if it isn't that interesting. So selective attention tends to improve in middle childhood, which we've been able to detect not only from behavioral studies, but from brain scans. And we also see that reaction time shortens. And what that means is that the efficiency of connections speeds up, so that when you ask a question, you can give a quicker answer. Or if you want to maybe reach for something, you're faster to get to it. So in general, we see an increase in efficiency of various connections in middle childhood, particularly those that have to do with connecting up the frontal lobes to the rest of the brain. And there's also some evidence that suggests that we get better at what's called lateralization, which is integrating skills from one side of the brain to the other, better able to integrate and demonstrate more fluidity and coordination in our motor actions as well as the way we think about things. Now, during middle childhood, one of the important contexts for development is unstructured play with other peers. Now, this can be impacted by lots of environmental factors. For example, right now, as you're listening to this lecture, we're in the fall of 2020, where we have a pandemic that has made it difficult for children to spend time with children from other families who maybe aren't in their so-called bubble. So there's less access to peers, there's less opportunity for unstructured play with other children. And this could have some downstream negative effects should this pandemic go on for too long, because it's through that unstructured opportunity with other children where there isn't an adult or a babysitter or an older sibling to mediate or facilitate. We learn a lot by being able to negotiate in play with other kids. We learn a lot by having experiences losing and winning, having to figure out together what game to play, having to come up with the rules that we'll all agree to. And play at this time is oftentimes more complex, more interactive, and really requires for a child to use communication and language much more than it did when they were younger. So as we see children having less access to unstructured play, we may find that we need to create opportunities for them to engage in these other behaviors. Now, we also know that in unstructured play, there's a possibility of having a child be excluded or bullied or not treated very well within that context. And in fact, that's a very common experience for all of us in middle childhood. It's quite rare to have a child who never feels excluded from play. It's usually something that everybody encounters. We become particularly concerned if one child experiences that most of the time, and that's where we want to try to intervene. This is a time where we may do some instruction on including others in play in, say, a school environment, and then create opportunities through recess where the children can then practice and generalize those skills. So we do want to think about the importance of unstructured play. It's an important compatible opportunity for learning how to play that goes along with the more organized activities that many parents these days seek out. For many children of this age, they get the bulk of their exercise during the day when they're at school. And physical education and recess are a critical time for helping learners consolidate what they've just learned and be able to maintain their alertness and the appropriate arousal level through the rest of the school day. So we actually have several studies by pediatricians and health and exercise scientists which suggest that brief periods of exercise are critical for children's learning. and that if a school decides to replace physical education or recess with additional academic time, you actually don't see significant academic gains. And in some cases, you actually see a decrement or a loss in academic achievement, because just requiring a child to engage in academic material more is not enough to encourage learning. As a field, we see the research suggesting that you need to have high expectations academically in the middle childhood years, and you need to individualize your teaching approach, but just about every child needs breaks from the academics to consolidate what they've learned, to take a break, especially if they have a hard time processing language, and get some physical exercise that will help regulate emotions, keep them more alert, and help with attention. So recess and phys ed are thought to be quite important, not just for physical health, but also for academic achievement. As a psychologist who often works in schools, I can't tell you how often I've been called in where a child has a behavioral problem and the response by the school team has been to not allow him to go to recess, but to instead stay inside and do his homework. And that often just leads to a downward spin that then that child can't regulate very well throughout the day. When I hear about a child who's behaving poorly at a certain time of the day, every day, my first question is, how much physical movement does the child have? Could we take more frequent motor breaks? Could we find a way to start the day with several walks around the track, or what in my experience has been the best for children who are behaviorally dysregulated, if it's possible, is if a school has access to a pool and we can start the day with a swimming, just a free swim, if that's at all possible, for 20 or 30 minutes. That can often enable a dysregulated child or a child who struggles with attention and behavioral regulation to do better for longer. So we don't want to take away exercise opportunities based on poor behavior. Instead, we want to think about how can we build in more opportunities for movement so that we see better behavior. And in addition, if during the school day we can help a child find a type of exercise that they enjoy, that could be a lifetime investment in their health. Now, during middle childhood, while I've talked about it as a time of growth and stability, there are some health problems that can emerge in this time. This is when, if a child is going to have a chronic condition such as an allergy or asthma or weight problems, those things may emerge and need more management. This is also the time in our lives where parents become a bit less involved in the child's daily habits, and the child is taking more responsibility for how he or she spends their time. So the health habits that are formed in middle childhood tend to persist across adolescence and adulthood. So this is a time where I often recommend to parents that they set limits on screen time, in particular video games. Personally, I think it's a bad idea to take video games away from a child, to say they can never have them. That just increases their desire to do it. But they need to learn to regulate. They need to learn to participate in those activities for a certain amount of time and then leave those activities and do something else. So the middle childhood years are a great time for parents to teach their kids moderation. Yes, you can play Super Mario 3, but how about if you do it for an hour and then you go outside and play for an hour, and then you do your homework, and then you can play your game again. So this is the time where the parents take the role of helping to organize the child's day, but the children are often making many, many more decisions themselves, and we need to give them some guidance so they can make some decisions that will impact their health over time. And same with how they're spending their time in leisure. This is a time when habits around nutrition can become set in stone, and habits around falling asleep at night. So we want to help kids develop healthy habits in middle childhood. And then bit by bit, as parents or teachers, we become less involved and the child can carry those habits forward. One of the big concerns for health in middle childhood in the United States is childhood obesity. And if any of you are interested in this topic and would like to learn more, there's a professor in Human Development and Family Studies who studies childhood obesity, and it could be very interesting to join her research team. And that professor is Lauren Schumacher. So if that's an interest of yours, check out her program. You may also find that professors in health and exercise science and those in food and nutrition would also provide opportunities to engage in projects focused on childhood obesity. So in 2012, epidemiologists discovered that almost 20%, approximately 18% of 6 to 11-year-olds were obese, which has a clinical definition that is basically based on your body mass index and whether or not your body mass index is above a certain percentile. We'll talk about that in a moment, but there are clinical criteria for it that are stable. 18% is quite a large number. Now, it's increasing worldwide. It's more than doubled in Mexico in the past few decades, along with the United States and Canada. And if a child is overweight, they are at greater risk to develop asthma, high blood pressure, and elevated cholesterol, all of which have long-term health effects. And as the excessive weight builds, many children experience difficult time seeing themselves in a positive way. We can see self-esteem get impacted, especially with a really active social media presence that doesn't always portray realistic body images. But additional weight not only challenges our physical health, but can make it harder to cope with stresses and social issues with peers. In fact, we see that children who are overweight are at greater risk of being rejected by peers and are at greater risk of reporting loneliness, which can be associated with depression and, unfortunately, self-harm. So helping a child to maintain a healthy body weight is an important goal, not just for physical health, but for emotional health. And when we think about healthy body weight, it's important to talk about how genetics have a lot to do with how our bodies are shaped, and there is no one right or correct way of being, and it isn't until your weight becomes into the obese range that many people find it's clinically significant to focus on. Most important thing, psychologists would say, is to think about the person's self-image and if they're happy with their weight and if their weight is within the range of the healthy parameters. The way we measure those healthy parameters, as I mentioned, is through the body mass index, or BMI. This is basically a ratio of your weight to your height. So you take a person's weight and you divide it by the square of their height. Then you come up with a number. That number is then looked at through a chart of norms that give you percentiles. Percentiles basically allow the number of an individual to be compared to the number for all other people of that person's age. So if your weight is at the 50th percentile, that means that you weigh as much as 50% of other children your age. So a BMI above the 85th percentile, meaning that a person weighs more than 85% of other kids their age, is thought to be overweight, and a BMI above the 95th percentile is thought to be obese. So we often intervene with diet and exercise at the 85th percentile from a nursing or doctor's perspective, and it becomes particularly important to do so if a child were to score above the 95th percentile. And the way that we track this is basically through well-child visits. Every time a child goes to the pediatrician, they measure their height and their weight and they compare it to the charts. So the causes of childhood obesity are actually quite complex, and a lot of studies are being done to try to understand it. There are genetic factors that have to do with the rates of metabolism and how different things are absorbed in our bodies. The habits that our parents teach us around food can be a factor, and the food that we grow up with is going to, in a sense, set up our nutritional habits for the future. There are also policies in society that can contribute to obesity. So you may recall a really controversial policy in New York City was to make it illegal to sell soft drinks above a certain number of ounces. And many people didn't like this because they felt that it was really against their individual rights. If they wanted to buy a 32-ounce Coke, they felt that they should be able to do that. Plus, many would comment they can simply buy two 16-ounce drinks and get the same thing. Well, the idea behind the policy for the public health folks that were in favor of it was that if you make it a policy that you cannot get a 32-ounce soda, it helps to educate the public about the health impact of ingesting that many sugars in that drink. So it can be controversial to have policies that limit individual freedoms, one might say, with what you can eat or drink. On the other side, they would say that, well, our whole society pays the cost in health costs when we have an overweight population, that there is a true societal cost to being overweight. And so people who believe in policies that would regulate these things would say helping the public become aware of what is unhealthy is going to benefit society, particularly when it comes to the overall health and the economic viability of supporting health. So it's something that we'll each develop our own thoughts about, but just wanted to let you know that in the area of public health, you'll often run into this debate. Now, other health problems that can emerge in middle childhood that are important to consider include asthma. This is particularly critical because it is also increasing, particularly in the cities in the United States. So the definition of asthma is that it's a chronic disease of the respiratory system, meaning that it's an ongoing condition where there's some inflammation or swelling which narrows your airways between your nose to your mouth to your lungs, and that leads to difficulty in breathing. So a child may be wheezing, have shortness of breath, feel tight in their chest, or may cough a lot. Now, for some, there are mild symptoms of asthma, and with an inhaler, those symptoms can pass. Some children will grow out of asthma, others will have it across a lifetime. Then there are also children for whom most of the time their asthma is mild, but they can have an asthma attack which is very significant and can actually lead to a loss of consciousness or even death. So we want to be really thoughtful about how we support children's respiratory health. There are several studies that suggest that there are indoor and outdoor pollutants that contribute to the onset of asthma, particularly when there's a genetic background for respiratory illness. So you may have this interaction between living in an environment that has unhealthy air, and then if you have the genetic predisposition to respiratory problems, it leads to asthma. Whereas another person who doesn't have that predisposition to respiratory problems could live in that same environment and not develop asthma. There's also the idea that they call the hygiene hypothesis, which suggests that since firstborn children are actually more likely to develop asthma than those born later, the thought has been that trying to keep children too clean, and many parents will tell you they're better at keeping their firstborns clean and they start to care less about those things, not care less, but it becomes harder to manage as they have subsequent children, so that firstborn children are often raised in environments that are maybe more hygienic, but that means less contact with microbes, which means less stimulation of natural immune factors. So if you keep the environment too clean around a child, you may actually compromise the ability of their system to fight germs. So the hygiene hypothesis is supported by this idea that firstborn children are more likely to have it. A second piece of evidence that supports the hygiene hypothesis is that children who grow up in farms tend to have much lower rates of asthma and allergies than other children. Now, for asthma, you might think, well, maybe they're not around pollutants. Well, it turns out there are an awful lot of pollutants that are used in agricultural environments, and there's a lot of exposure to allergens in agricultural environments. So trying to understand why children who are raised in farming communities are less vulnerable to allergies and asthma is quite interesting to scientists and could contribute to this idea that your system needs to be exposed to a certain amount of pollutants or germs in order to get good at managing them. When we look at how much we see asthma in the United States, 14% of children under the age of 18 have a diagnosis of asthma as of 2015. There are also some data that suggest that children from certain ethnic groups tend to be more likely to have asthma. And in our country, it's African American children and children who are Hispanic or Latino, particularly from Dominican and Puerto Rican communities. So scientists are trying to understand why this is. It could have to do with some shared genetics, but an important thing to keep in mind is that children from these groups tend to have a greater likelihood of living in communities that are poorer economically, and poorer economic communities do have established data that demonstrate that they tend to have more pollutants in their environment. That in the United States, certain environmental protections that are not present in cities could be adversely affecting children of color who grow up in those cities. So for us locally here in Colorado, Commerce City is one of the poorer communities overall in our state. It also has the worst air quality of any of the other communities in the state of Colorado. So whether that's a lack of political power, a lack of empowerment of the population, or simply just the way that community grew, there's often a correlation between the socioeconomic status of a community and how clean the air and water are. And that's an issue that many environmentalists, public health officials, and politicians and people involved in government are focused on, is to try to make sure that we reduce the risk on children who grow up in poorer communities to these pollutants. So, in conclusion, middle childhood in general should be a period of stability and health and developmental flourishing, but whether or not every child gets to experience that is going to depend on the quality of their family relationships and their educational opportunities. And oftentimes it has to do with their neighborhoods, where they live, and how safe their environment is. Their social relationships with peers, how they are treated by their teachers, will also influence their development. And their overall health can often be affected by all of these contexts. Helping kids to develop healthy routines for nutrition and exercise, and to have opportunities to experience a sense of confidence, to see themselves in a positive light, is really critical. So as we move forward in our coverage of chapters in middle childhood, we're going to keep coming back to this idea that this is a time period where, whether we're parents, teachers, or otherwise interacting with kids at this age, we can help them a great deal by helping them to build a strong sense of themselves and to build those healthy habits because they feel and truly believe that they are worth it. And so improving self-esteem and self-efficacy is a huge part of helping a child in this age to continue a healthy life. Thank you for your time and attention. Our next lecture will be on the development of psychopathology in middle childhood.